So welcome to session 5, Public Programs and Women's Labor Force or Mothers Labor Force Participation. We have 3 great presenters today, 3 great papers. So I will not delay and let them go right ahead. The first paper will be the impact of universal preschool on maternal labor supply. And the presenter will be Heli Xu from South China University of Technology. Heli, go right ahead. Thanks.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Heli, and the topic of my paper is the impact of universal preschool on maternal labor supply. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah. The motivation of this paper is the childcare crisis in the United States. In 2016, nearly 2/3 of the parents and 95% of low-income parents would spend above the 7% federal affordability benchmark for center-based childcare. Therefore, center-based childcare in the United States can be very expensive and unaffordable. It kept women out of the labor force. This is a hot issue during the COVID-19 pandemic because more than 1 in 10 mothers of young children left their jobs due to the childcare responsibilities. And universal childcare or universal preschool seems to be a very good solution for the childcare crisis in the United States. Also, it is important for any policy effort to promote gender equity. In 2021, President Joe Biden released his American Family Plan, proposing that the United States will provide universal preschool to all 3 and 4 years old children and ensure that no household spend more than 7% of its income on childcare. This is a signal that in the future we will have more universal pre-K programs in the United States. Okay, next. Therefore, in this paper, I try to identify the impact of universal pre-K programs in the United States. In the literatures for public kindergarten, researchers reach an agreement that the public kindergarten enrollment can increase the labor supply for mothers, particularly for single mothers without additional young children. But the impact of pre-K is still under debate. For example, South 2014 and MELAC 2018 shows that mothers are more likely to join the labor force due to the public pre-K programs. However, using the data from Georgia and Oklahoma, Fitzpatrick and Casio find that it's hard to draw the conclusion about the positive effect. Fitzpatrick 2010 mentioned that there is no discernible relationship exists between a child being born before and after the cutoff date and maternal employment. Casio 2013 find ambiguous results depending on the method used. She used both diffing deep and triple difference model, and she finds that the results are not robust to different specifications. Okay, next one. Next one. Yeah. In this paper, I find that kids are significantly more likely to participate in the pre-K programs in fall semester, whereas their mothers tend to wait until next semester, spring semester, to join the labor force. I find this kind of delay effect. And the labor force participation rate increased for less educated mothers, married mothers, and mothers without additional young children. These results are robust to both diffing deep and triple difference model. And I also find that mothers spend more time on seeking jobs. The contribution of this paper is that in terms of results, it provides some explanations to why previous studies have produced inconsistent results. And in terms of data, I used most recent data from 2004 to 2016, and I pulled the data from 6 states with universal pre-K programs instead of focusing on 1 or 2 states. And in terms of methodology, I followed the kids before and after the academic years begins, and I think I didn't see that before. Okay, next slide. The framework of study. In this paper, I performed both diffing deep and triple difference analysis to explore 3 sources of variation in the data. The first one is state policy variation. I followed Casio 2017's paper to choose treaty states and control states. In that paper, she studies the impact of universal preschool on child development without looking at labor outcomes. The treaty states are the states with large universal pre-K programs like Georgia, Oklahoma, New York, Florida, Wisconsin, and West Virginia. And control states are the states with small or no state-funded programs. And then I also discussed the difference between different school entry cohorts. I divide children around 4 years old into 2 cohorts, older cohort and younger cohort. Kids in the older cohort are born 6 months before the cutoff month. So suppose that the eligibility rule is 4 years old by September 1st, then they are born from March to August. Similarly, kids in the younger cohort are born 6 months after the cutoff month. that their birth months run from September to February. You can see that children in different school entry cohort are born in different months. So even though they grow up to 5 or 6 years old, they still belong to different school entry cohort. Therefore, next, I follow these kids over time to explore the effect by semesters. This is the timeline in my paper. So I divide it into pre-period and post-period. Pre-period refers to the 8 months before the academic year begins. It means that in pre-period, both younger and older cohorts are not eligible to the universal pre-K programs. And then on September 1st, when the 4th semester begins, the older cohort can be enrolled in the pre-K programs, but the younger kids are still too young to attend the program. And in this paper, I follow the kids 3 semesters after the September 1st. It means that I have 8 months in my pre-period and 16 months in post-period. In total, I have a 2 years time window. The underlying assumption of this paper is that the universal pre-K programs have the most significant effect on the maternal labor supply for eligible kids only after academic year begins. Okay, next. Because I find that the largest effect among less educated mothers, so I spend one more slide here to discuss why the possible reasons for why universal preschool particularly benefits them. The first reason might be crowd-out effect. Best of 2014 shows that public childcare providers in Georgia and Oklahoma crowd out the private ones. Casio 2013 finds that crowd-out effect has larger impact on more educated mothers. And the second reason is that the lower income and the lower labor force participation rate for less educated mothers. Lower income means that expenditure on the daycare is likely to account for a larger fraction of the total income and cause larger effect. And lower labor force participation rate means that there is a larger room for them to join the labor force. These are the reasons given by Hardoy 2015. They find that Norway's full day subsidized childcare had a stronger impact on labor supply of less educated mothers. Okay, next slide. Next one, thank you. This page is about why delays occur, because I find that mothers join the labor force in spring instead of fall semester. One of the potential reasons for mothers choose not working immediately might be the income effect. In my research, I find that the universal preschool decreased the childcare payment. Therefore, mothers may consume more later in this case. And another reason is given by Fisher 2010. She mentioned that female labor supply elasticities are smaller now than they once were. And it means that women are no longer as responsive to wage changes as before. And in my paper, I try to argue that demands of home and adaptation time might be the reason why the mothers were not that responsive during the fall semester. And I think the main reason for the mothers to join the labor force is substitute effect. In the traditional two-good model for mothers who originally worked less, the price subsidy provides incentive for mothers to work. So finally, they go to work in spring. Okay, next slide, please. And about the data for this paper, I have 2 data sources. The first one is SIPP from 2004 to 2016. In the main identification strategy, I used a full cross-sectional data. I pulled the data based on children's age. It means that children in pre-period and post-period may not be exactly the same ones. And in the robustness check, I created a panel data set. It means that I only include children and their mothers that can be continuously observed in the 2-year window into the data set. And another data source of my paper is the state of preschool yearbooks produced by National Institute for Early Education Research. And it provides yearly data on pre-K programs by state, such as enrollment rate, cutoff rules, income requirement, and etc. The information is collected from state preschool administrators. Okay, next one. In this graph, I show the pre-K and kindergarten enrollment rate from using SIPP 2014 panel. The solid line represents the older kids in the treated state, and the dotted line shows the older kids in the control state. We can see that in pre-period, the enrollment rate are quite similar between treated state and the control state, but in September, when the academic year began, the enrollment rate of older kids in, I'm sorry, it's not this page. It's so can you show me the, yes, last page. Sorry. So I'm talking about this graph. You can see that in prepare they are quite similar to the each other, and starting from September they start to differentiate from each other. And during the summer vacation in July, the enrollment rate dropped to the lowest level for both groups. So that's my pre-period and 3 post-period. Okay, next one. So this graph is about the raw labor force participation rate. In this page, I plot the raw labor force participation rate for mothers in treated states. The dark line represents the mothers of older kids, and the line light gray shows the labor force participation rate for mothers of younger kids. We can see that they started to differentiate from each other since January, and the gap closed on the 2nd September when all of the younger kids are eligible to the pre-K programs and older kids can attend kindergarten. So based on this graph, I first performed a deep analysis in my research. And next slide. Yes. So in the definitive model, I compared the older and younger cohort, younger kids before and after academic year begins within treated states, and this is the equation where IST is the outcome variable for mother's I in state S that observed in time t, and post t equals 1 if mother I is observed in post period, older I equals 1 if the child I is in the older cohort, and X is the set of demographic controls. I control the relative age fixed effect and time fixed effect. And in the event study, the older I times post t is replaced with a full set of time dummies interacted with treated S. Next slide. So to explore the effect by semesters, the post period dummy is divided into separate time dummies. Post t equals 1 if mother is observed in the first full semester, September to December, and post 2 equals 1 if the mother is observed in the following spring semester, and post 3 equals 1 represents the rest time of the second year. Okay, next slide. And this is the result table. In column 1, I show that in treated state compared to the time before older children formally start their pre-K program in September, mothers from the older cohort are 2.6 percentage points more likely to join the labor force during the spring semester relative to the months in the younger cohort, relative to the mothers in the younger cohort, sorry. So in pre-period, the raw labor force participation rate for, yes, this table, for all mothers in treated states is around 66 percentage points. It means 4% increase. And in column 2, I show that there is no such effect in control states. And in the other column, I show that the labor force participation rate increased more for less educated mothers, married mothers, and mothers without additional young children. And I find the largest effect for the less educated mothers. Okay, next slide. So the problem with deep model is that I only use the data from the treated states. But I find the largest effect for spring. It's hard for me to argue that the effect occurred in the new calendar year is caused by the universal pre-K. Maybe it's simply because children grow up and their mothers hope to find a new job in a new year. Therefore, I extend the deep model to a triple difference model. In the triple difference model, I use state with small or no state-bounded program as control, and treat it as equals 1 if they have universal pre-K program. And the other notations are the same as before. So I don't want to read the equation again. So next slide. So this is the result table for the triple difference model. It is quite similar to the last one. The magnitude of the coefficient increased a little when I add control states, but not much. The labor force participation rate still increased for less educated mothers, married mothers, and mothers without additional young children. And I find the largest effect for less educated mothers in column 2. Okay, next one. Next slide. Yeah. So because I find the largest effect for less educated mothers, so I created event study graph for less educated mothers and more educated mothers separately. And in the event study, post-it is replaced with a full set of time dummies, and I plot the key coefficient of interest. I find that there is almost no effect for the more educated mothers, but starting from January, when spring semester began, less educated mothers are more likely to join the labor force. Okay, next one. And this is event study graph for less educated mothers with 90% confidence interval. We can see that from March to June, the coefficients are significantly greater than 0. Okay. Next one. So here are some more results. In this table, I hope to show that half of the reason that why less educated mothers are more likely to join the labor force is that they are seeking for new jobs. They are not. Does not necessarily mean that they are being employed. They're actively looking for jobs. Okay. Next slide. So this is a robustness check using panel data. In the main analysis, I pulled the children based on children's age. Therefore, I have different children surveyed in different years in order to show that the positive effect in spring is not driven by different sample in different year. I created a data set that all of the children and their mothers can be continuously observed for the 2 years. In this case, the sample size is much smaller, but I can follow Baker 2016's method to run the analysis. This method is very close to the event study of triple difference model. The only difference is that the controls are more rigorous. For example, the demographic controls is replaced with individual fixed effect, and post-it dummy is replaced with time fixed effect. Treated as dummy is replaced with state fixed effect, and other eye dummy is replaced with relative age fixed effect. So next page. Yes, so you can see that the results are very similar to the previous one. I conduct a joint test and show that for less educated mothers, the coefficients are significantly greater than 0 from January to June in the spring semester. And mothers belong to different education group behave differently in spring semester. Okay, next. And here is some more discussion using SIPP 2014 panel. Here I use the difference in difference to compare older and younger cohort in treated and control states. And here is the equation. So we can skip to the results. Yeah, next slide. Yeah. So in column 3, I show that the older kids are 20 percentage points more likely to be enrolled in the fall semester, which is very close to Cassio's finding. And in column 5, I find that the impact of labor force participation rate is negative, but I show that the difference exists in the pre-period. Therefore, it's important to see what happened before academic year begins. And in column 7, I show that for mothers who pay for childcare, the weekly childcare payment decreases by $96 per week. And next page. And next page is about why do delays occur. This is what I'm currently working on. I matched the data from current population survey and American time use survey. I find that compared to the mothers in the control state, mothers of 4 years old in treated states spend more time on home production activities during the vacations and holidays like May, August, and December. Also, I find that treated mothers need some more time to adapt to new life or prepare for the coming vacations in months such as April and September. Therefore, together with the evidence that universal pre-K decrease the weekly childcare payment, I hope to argue that the income effect, demand of home, and adaptation time might be the reasons why mothers choose not working immediately in fall semester. Okay. And
okay, you have 2 minutes.
The last page is conclusion. So In this paper, I explore the impact of universal childcare on maternal labor supply by semesters using different models. And I find that children are enrolled in fall and mothers join the labor force in spring. And I find that universal pre-K programs have the largest positive effect for less educated mothers and little to no effect for more educated mothers. And half of the reason that less educated mothers are more likely to join the labor force is that they spend more time on seeking jobs. And this finding provides some explanations to why previous studies have produced inconsistent results and may provide some insight into the impact of President Joe Biden's American Families Plan on Universal Preschool in 2021. Yeah, that's all. And thank you. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Helly. Our next presenter will be Ashley Erseg, looking at the long-run effects of childcare subsidies on maternal labor market outcomes. And Ashley's from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln.
Can everyone hear me okay? Can I just get like a thumbs up? Are we good? Okay. So yeah, as she said, my name is Ashley Erseg, and I'm excited to present my paper on the long-run effects of childcare subsidies on maternal labor market outcomes. You get to hear that long title one more time. And then I just want to say this does use restricted access data, so I think I have to always issue this caveat that the results here don't reflect the views of the Census Bureau and that it did make it through disclosure review. Okay, you can move on to the next slide. So childcare, as we just learned, childcare is incredibly expensive. And every time I give this talk, somebody comes up and tells me like this really insane childcare cost. Currently, the record I believe is $4,000 per month. But that's like not particularly uncommon. A care.com survey surveys parents all over the United States, and last year they found that over half of parents who are using childcare are spending 20% of their income or more on childcare expenses, which is a really, really large amount of money to spend on childcare. And a lot of research has shown that women are, mothers, are very, very sensitive to the cost of childcare, and they make pretty large work-related changes, which can range from reducing their hours of work to take care of their children, or can be leaving the labor market entirely. And I think, as they said before, the COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted this issue, and this is something that women had to deal with. I believe women with young children were the biggest job losses during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this has really long-lasting effects on women's labor supply. Women who exit the labor market to care for their children have a much harder time re-entering the labor market, and their earnings are depressed throughout their entire lives. So they earn less throughout their entire life cycle. There are a lot of studies that have sort of documented the short-run effects of childcare subsidies, but very few studies look at the long-run effects, mostly due to data constraints. And even fewer studies are looking at how timing of subsidy receipt can interact with women's labor market decisions. And when I say timing of subsidy receipt, what I'm really talking about is timing relative to when you give birth to your first child. So the idea here is giving women access to more affordable childcare when they're young. We actually keep them in the labor market and help mitigate some of those child penalty issues. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. So this brings me to the main research question of this paper, which is what is the effect of offering childcare subsidies or relatively more affordable childcare to women soon after they give birth to their first child? I use two main sources of variation here. The first is timing of birth of a woman's first child, and the second is the 2003 expansion to the Child and Dependent Care Credit, which is a federal non-refundable childcare subsidy that partially refunds the cost of childcare for working parents, which is very important. This is a work incentive. I use restricted access data that links IRS and Social Security administrative tax data to the to the SIPP. It's called the synthetic SIPP data, although I have had the results validated against the gold standard file here. And the great thing about this is that I'm able to see a woman's complete earnings history through 2014 for all women who appear in the SIPP 84 to 2008. And what I do here really simply is I compare women who are exposed to the 2003 expansion to the Child and Dependent Care Credit when their kids are quite young to women who are exposed to it when they're older. And then I use implicit eligibility requirements caused by the fact the credit is non-refundable to construct a triple difference as a sort of placebo test. And then I don't know that I'll have time to get into this, but I also use state year variation in the child independent care credit to construct a simulated instrument. And these results haven't been validated, but are largely in line with the ones I find in the main part of this paper. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So I have three main contributions, and this is in no particular order. One is just that this credit is not super well studied. Current research has found positive effects for married women because this is non-refundable. It's mostly used by middle and upper class women, but no real effect on women who are single, or married women who are, sorry, excuse me, mothers who are single. Another contribution is that while we have quite a bit of studies on the short run effect of childcare subsidies, there aren't as many looking at the long run effects, at least in the United States, using currently in practice programs. And a lot of this just comes from data constraints. And so I'm able to overcome this using a panel data set. Often we'll look at public schooling as a sort of proxy for childcare, which has historically found really large gains, but there's some evidence that that's sort of waned over time. And very few studies are looking at this issue of timing. So timing here is important because by the time perhaps your child is 3 to 5 years old and eligible for childcare, you may have already made that decision to either stay in the labor market or to stay at home. And if a woman decides to stay at home to take care of her child, she's going to have those really long lasting effects on her labor supply and earnings. There is some work looking at work incentives overall, finding really large gains to exposure to a earned income tax credit expansion. But this is a really different population than who benefits from the child independent care credit. The child independent care credit, because it's non-refundable, is largely used by middle and high income individuals. You can go to the next slide. So my basic results are, I think, very intuitive, what you would expect to find. So one, women are more likely to be employed in the short run and also in the long run. So I interpret that as women are going back to work when their kids are young, but then also staying attached to the labor market. I find evidence of an increase in earnings in the short run, about 7%, which is about $2,000 additional dollars per year, and then really large effects in the long run. So 5 to 10 years after giving birth, women who are exposed to this subsidy expansion when their kids are young earn between 18 and 20% more per year, which is about $6,000 additional dollars. And looking at potential mechanisms, I find some evidence that that might be driven by spending more time in the labor market. You can go to the next slide. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of institutional background about the Child Independent Care Credit. As I said before, it is a federal non-refundable child care subsidy. It was originally created in 1976, and then it was expanded in 1983, and then in 2001 as part of the Bush tax cuts, but this 2001 expansion wasn't effective until 2003. I am focusing on the 2001 expansion in this paper, and there are sort of two main ways that this expansion affected the credit. So the first was that it increased the amount the credit was worth, and the second is that it flattened out the phase-out region. So this credit depends on the adjusted gross income of the filers. So the nominal increase was from $720 to about $1,050, which in 2022 dollars would be from about 1,100-ish to about 1,700. This is a work incentive, so it is contingent on your parents working. If you're married, both parents have to be employed. Single individuals can claim this credit, but they of course must be working. As I said before, the refund is contingent on the adjusted gross income. There's a schedule similar to the earned income tax credit. It can be used for up to 2 dependents under 13 years old who attend childcare. Childcare is very broadly defined. It can include formal and informal childcare, but something that is important here is you can't, for example, have your wife care for your child or your husband and count that as their employment. So it has to be a non-mother or non-father. And it's pretty easy to collect it. So you really only need two things: the taxpayer identification number of your provider and the annual cost of childcare. And I've gone through TurboTax and saw how, and clicked through, pretended I have a child to see how easy it is to claim. And it really is quite straightforward. And it's claimed by a lot of people. In 2017, 6.3 million families were claiming this credit. So quite a large population are actually making use of this credit. You can go to the next slide. So this is going to show you the real credit, the real maximum credit for a one-child family before and after the 2003 expansion by the federal adjusted gross income of that family. So I really want to draw your attention to sort of three things here, but I'll go in order. So the first is you can see that from 2003 to from before 2003 to after 2003, there is this pretty substantial increase in the credit. And then again, you're seeing that flattened out phase out region. So more individuals are making use of this credit. The next thing I really want to draw your attention to is, oh, sorry, can you go back? I said next, that's my problem. But what I really want to draw your attention to is the non-refundable aspect, which is going to cause there to be a difference between the statutory amount and the real amount that the credit is worth. So before I said that prior to the 2003 expansion, the credit was worth $720, but if you look at the blue line, you see it's worth about $600. And this is because of the way the tax credit interacts with the tax system as a whole, since it's non-refundable. So this, prior to the expansion, the maximum credit someone could collect was about $600, and after was a little under $950. Which really leads into the next thing, which is if you're looking at the left end where we have really low income individuals, they're not really making use of this credit. So they have a credit that's very, very close to zero or very low overall. And this is backed up by actual tax documents from the US Department of Treasury. Individuals who make less than $15,000 have an average credit of about $61 versus individuals who have a AGI over $15,000, they have an average credit of about $555. So we're seeing that because lower income people don't have enough tax liability, they are much less likely to make use of this credit. And when they actually do qualify for it, they qualify for a very small amount. Okay, now you can go to the next slide. So I use two data sources here. The first comes from the synthetic SIPP data, which I had validated. So this is administrative data that links IRS tax records and Social Security administrative earnings records to the 1984 through 2008 SIPP panels. And then I use the panel study of income dynamics. I follow a very similar data cleaning procedure for both of these, but essentially what I'm able to see with this administrative data is a woman's complete earnings history through 2014. So not just when she was present in the SIPP, but her entire earnings history through 2014. And it includes administrative records on a woman's first childbirth. This is live births, which is important here, but it contains administrative records on when she gave birth to her first child. And then I create two main variables here. The first is just whether or not a woman has any positive earnings. And if she does, I define her as being employed. And the second is I log transform her FICA earnings. So the two main outcomes that I'm looking at using the administrative data is you can go to the next one, is employment and then her earnings. Next is the panel study of income dynamics. So I'm sure some of you are somewhat familiar with the PSID. It is a panel, I believe it's the oldest running panel, maybe in the world, I know in the US for sure, which has run since 1968 and has followed individuals and their descendants on an annual basis and then biannually since 1997. The childbirth and adoption history file assigns live births and adoption to everybody in the PSID. And I use this information to link childbirth dates to women in the PSID. And then I create full year-by-year histories for all the women captured in the PSID, but I of course focus in on mothers here. And I examine total annual hours of work for all the mothers captured in this sample. Okay, you go to the next slide. So my sample I follow the same sample restrictions for the most part between these two samples. So it's made up of individuals between 1985 and 2014. This is only mothers, so I'm only looking at mothers here. I limit to women who are employed at some time prior to giving birth, because what I'm really interested in is whether or not women stay employed. While I do think that looking at all women is interesting, I'm choosing to focus on women who were employed at some point prior to giving birth. And then I'm going to define my treatment variable based on early or late exposure. And so early and late exposure has to do with how much subsidy a woman has access to. So I define someone as early exposed to the 2003 expansion if she gives birth between 2001 and 2006. So she will have access to this higher subsidy amount from when her child is 2 or younger. So some of these women have access to this higher subsidy amount from infancy. And then I define late exposed as women who give birth between 1994 and 2000. So these women are exposed between 9 and 3, or sorry, they experience the expansion when their children are between 3 and 9 years old. And I choose these dates really just because at 3 is when children start to be eligible for preschool. And then according to my Googling, 9 is about when children start to get left home. But I do try some other, I don't present this here, but I do look at other potential groupings. They haven't been validated. And then I'm going to define eligibility based on earnings prior to giving birth. So as I said before, this is non-refundable. So women, once again, with really low income are not eligible to actually receive the subsidy in most circumstances. So I define a woman who has income greater than $15,000 prior to giving birth as being eligible for the subsidy, and women who have earnings less than $15,000 prior to giving birth as ineligible for the subsidy. You can move on to the next slide. So I implement a dynamic difference in difference, which really just allows me to dynamically estimate the effect of early exposure to these policies in each year around birth. So this is in event time. So I define an event as the year a woman gives birth to her first child. So event time equal to 0 is when a woman gives birth. Event time equal to 1 would be 1 year after giving birth when your child is 1, and sort of so on and so forth. So I have my 3 outcomes of interest for some individual I in year of first birth E, in year T, in year relative to first birth tau. And I have event time dummy variables where I omit tau equal to -2. I do this just because I cannot determine whether or not someone was pregnant in the year prior to giving birth. This is a two-way fixed effect model where I capture person and year fixed effects. And early, once again, is an indicator for having a first birth between 2001 and 2006. So here, treatment is defined as giving birth and being early exposed to the 2003 expansion to the Child Independent Care Credit. I have 2 basic assumptions here, which are really going to be the same for any difference in difference model, which is common trends and no contemporaneous shocks. For no contemporaneous shocks, I really control for 2 main policies, maternity leave legislation, and then access to universal preschool or kindergarten. You can move on to the next slide. Because we're always worried about the common trends assumption, I do implement a triple difference design where I interact the event time dummies and early exposure with eligible, which once again, I define eligibility as having an income greater than $15,000 before giving birth. And I just want to say for this specific equation, I do include all interactions and main effects. It just becomes a really long and messy equation. And so here, what I'm really identifying in my triple difference design is the difference between the gap in outcomes between between eligible and ineligible early exposed individuals and eligible and ineligible late exposed individuals. And so once again, we have the trends assumption, which is slightly different here since we're talking about common trends between differences, and then no contemporaneous shocks, which I control once again for universal preschool, kindergarten, or maternity leave legislation. You can move on to the next slide. So my main interest here is to, of course, dynamically estimate the effect here. So I'm really going to break this up into the short run effect, which I define as 0 to 4 years after giving birth, and the long run effect, which I define as 5 to 10 years after giving birth. So this is the difference in difference and triple difference estimates over the first 4 years after giving birth. So between infancy and 4 years old. So we look at employment, earnings, and total hours worked. Depending on my specification, women who are exposed to the 2003 expansion to the Child Independent Care Credit are between 1.2 and 2.5 percentage points more likely to be employed. This is associated with between a 7 and 12% increase in earnings, although it's only marginally significant with my difference in difference strategy, which would be about $2,000 to $3,600 additional dollars per year. And then moving on to total hours worked, I do see a difference here in sign, which is not ideal for a difference in difference and triple difference strategy if I'm using it as a placebo test. But the main implication here is the exact same, which is that there is no statistically significant evidence that women are changing their hours of work on the intensive margin. Assuming a woman works 52 hours a week, this would be between a decrease of about an hour to an increase of about 5.3 hours per week, but again, not statistically significant. So just sort of to recap my findings in the short run, women are more likely to work, and there is some evidence that they are earning more, although it's not significant. And then there's not really evidence that they're working more. Okay, you can move on to the short run effect.
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, I can get through this. Okay, so I do not have enough data to look at total hours worked, but I still look at the long run effect on employment and earnings. So I find more substantial effects. So depending on my specification, 5 to 10 years after giving birth, women are working between 3.1 and 5 point, or more likely are between 3.1 and 5.2 percentage points more likely to work. And they're earning between 18 and 20% more per year, which is about $6,000. So again, I interpret this that women are going back to work when their kids are young and then staying employed. And then this is leading to substantial earnings increases. Okay, you can switch to the next one, which is mechanism. So obviously, if we're seeing these huge earnings increases, we want to know why. I look at the total time a woman spends employed 10 years after giving birth. I find evidence using my difference in difference model that women who are early exposed to this have a little under an additional year in the labor market, but that's not robust to a triple difference specification. And then you can move on. So I'll just briefly say this. My short run results are similar to those found in Gabriella Pepin's paper in 2020, which are that women are more likely to work and that they have higher earnings. Comparing it to the earned income tax credit, I find evidence that the earned income tax credit essentially increased the probability of employment more than this credit, but I found far more substantial earnings returns, which I essentially attribute to the fact that middle and higher income women may just have a different earnings profile. And then you can go to the next slide, which is my conclusion. So this paper investigates the effect of childcare subsidies given soon after first birth on women's labor market outcomes. I use variation caused by the 2003 expansion to the Child Independent Care Credit and timing of birth. And I consider long run effects and whether or not timing of childcare subsidy or seat interacts with women's labor market outcomes. My general findings are that this increases the probability a woman works and increases her long run earnings pretty substantially, between like 5,600 and 6,300 additional dollars per year in the long run. And that is the end of my presentation. The next one is just a thank you. I hope I got to time.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Okay. Now, good job wrapping that up so quickly. I appreciate that and understand how hard that is. Our final presenter is Wei Zhang from Southwestern University of Finance and Economics, talking about the impact of child tax credit on maternal labor supply. Take it away, Wei.
Hi, I'm Wei, and I'm an assistant professor in Southwestern University of Finance and Economics, so greetings from China. And today I will present my paper on the research in the impact of child tax credit on maternal labor supply. So next slide, please. We know that childhood poverty will negatively affect the health and earnings when the people are in adulthood, and nearly 60% of all poor children live in a single mother families in US. So they are the most vulnerable groups that our public policy should support. There is a social safety net, including earned income tax credit, food stamp, and SNAP in US to protect these children. Nearly all the research about the earned income tax credit prove that refundable child-related tax credit will provide some working incentives for the mothers. The reason there are two reasons about this very special tax credit structure. First, the claimants should have to work to be eligible for this tax credit. And then if their income falls into the phasing range in the tax structure, the income, the substitute effect might outweigh the income effect, causing the working incentives. So in these studies, we don't look at EITC but the CTC because they are less researched in the literature. And another reason for looking at the CTC is that we have the most recent expansion of CTC since 2021. And we have to say that although the act is no longer extended now, but there are some discussion that we should extend the reform and make it permanently. So it's necessary to analyze the cost and the benefits of this very special tax credit. As I say that there are plenty of literature about EITC, they find that there are positive effects of this tax credit on maternal labor supply and children well-being. So why do we bother to care about CTC, which has a smaller amount of benefit? That is because CTC and EITC are really different in some aspects. So so Leanna, could you please push the button here? Yeah. There are several differences. So first, in this graph, we can see that the y-axis indicates the benefits the family can claim, and the x-axis indicates their incomes. The dashed line shows the EITC schedules, while the solid line shows the CTC schedule, and the different colors indicate the different family size. That means how many children under 17-year-old you have in the household. And we can see that for the EITC, there is no income threshold to be eligible for the tax. Even if you earn zero, you can get that. But at least before the 2021, you need to have some income to be eligible for CTC. And another difference is that for EITC, only it just hits the lower income group. But for CTC, even if you earn as much as 140,000, you can be still eligible for the CTC. So the two tax credits target at different groups of people, and they might respond to the tax structure, the same tax structure really differently. So in the research study CTC, we can observe the groups who are from the higher socioeconomic status, which we cannot observe in the EITC research. So could you please go back to the motivation part? Okay, that's some the basic motivations about the research on CTC. From the literature view, there are fewer research study the labor supply effects of CTC, and the limited research, they either have the short time span, or they focus on the single mothers with teenager child, or they have the different conclusions, and we still need to explore more about CTC. Yeah, next slide, please. Next slide, please. In my paper, I have some major conclusions. I find that each $1,000 increase in average CTC will lead to the increase of labor participation rate of single mothers by 1.13 percentage points, and will also increase their weekly working hour by 0.37 hour. and the elasticity is within the range of EITC literature. And I also find that the effect is almost driven by mothers whose youngest child is from 3 to 5 years old. And the third conclusion is that CTC do not have any negative effects on married or college-educated mothers who are not observed in EITC literature. The last conclusion of CTC of this paper is also related to the childcare. I find that if mothers are induced into the labor market by the CTC, they tend to increase the likelihood of children being taken care of by their relatives. That means that they don't have time to take care of the children now. But they still don't receive money high enough that will make them put their children into the private childcare or any paid childcare form. My contribution are mostly the three parts in the literature. So first, I examined the average treatment effects of CTC on maternal labor supply, and using the large sample size, I can also examine the heterogeneous effects of the CTC expansion of single mothers, especially based on children's age and the race of the mothers. And the second contribution is related to the first one because I can observe the single mothers from the because I can observe all the mothers from higher socioeconomic status. So I find that they are not disincentives from the labor market. They still stay in the labor market, and our future expansion of the CTC will not lead to some situation that we have some lazy single mothers. They don't go to the work just because they receive more money. And the third contribution is that I studied the effects of CTC on child care arrangement, indicating some possible channels will influence the child well-being. So next slide, please. About the policy background, we know that the CTC initiated in 1997, and it's non-refundable tax credits initially, but it will become partially refundable in 2001. It's also only eligible for children who are under 17 years old. So if the child is above 17 years old, the family will lose this CTC credit. And it experiences two expansions afterwards. So first is the 2001 partially refundable reform, and after that, if you earn more than $10,000, the phasing range, you will get the 10% of the income to get the credit. But after the 2001, the phasing range increased a little bit, and the maximum credits you can enjoy is also increased from 400 to 600. The third major reform of CTC is in 2009. It decreased the income threshold from 10,000 to 3,000. That means more families with lower income can be eligible for the CTC now. So in 2010, if a single mother who are eligible for the CTC and they have two children, if she earned 20,000, if she earned 15,000, she can get $1,800 refundable for this family. We can see that here, even if in 2010 she didn't get the full, she can get the maximum credits because she had two children. She should be eligible for the 2,000, but now she only claimed 15. No, she only claimed 1,800. That means she might not earn earn too much money to be eligible for the maximum amount of CTC. So I think I think we go to go back. I think the slide should go back. Yeah. Oh, okay, here. Yeah, I finished this one. So next, please. Sorry, my mistake. From this graph, we can see the schedule of child tax credit, and all the solid line indicates the reform in 2001, and all the dashed line indicates the reform in 2009. So basically, all the variations of CTC comes from two aspects. One is the reform timing, and another is the number of children in the household. So we can see that different numbers indicate different color indicate the different number of children in the household. If you have more children, the families are eligible for more credits, and the CTC is not capped by the number of children. That means, unlike EITC, which is capped in 3, you can have as many or has as much as credit when you have more baby or more children. Yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah, we have already showed that. So next, please. Okay. From the theoretical perspective of view, we can see that if we are in the AB range here, which is the phasing range, the substitution effect might outweigh the income effect. But if we are in the BC range, which is the plateau range, the CTC credit is the CTC benefit is just like a lump sum subsidy, and it will decrease the labor supply. But my sample is focused on the single mothers who are more likely to fall into the phasing range of the income they earn. So in this AB range, I expect some positive labor supply effects. Next slide, please. Okay, from the literature, nearly all the literature of focusing on EITC, they find the positive effects on maternal labor supply, and the elasticity range from 0.14 to 2. But for the CTC research, they have the different conclusion. For example, the Feynman and the Wing gender, they both find that the CTC effect, CTC will decrease the maternal labor supply. But the most relevant papers from Lippold in 2019, he find that the CTC actually increased the labor supply of the single mothers, and we have the very similar elasticity, which is he had the 0.51, and I have the 0.59. So it's still under the discussion about CTC's effect. Okay, so next slide, please. The data is from the like SIPP from 1991 to 2013. I focused on single mothers aged from 20 to 64 with at least one children younger than 17 years old to be eligible for CTC. And the key outcome variable is whether the individual is currently with a job for at least 1 or more weeks in the reference month, and to examine the labor supply in extensive margin. Another is the weekly working hours in the reference month. The two variations still from the reform time and the family side. So next slide, please. Okay, this is the summary statistics, and we can see that the labor participation rate of the single mothers is higher than all the mothers, and but their working hours is less than all the working mothers. So next slide, please. In the traditional different model, I create 3 time dummies, which is post 1998, post 2001, post 2009. The theta IT is the number of children in the household. And I also add the state level control variables in the EAT ICT, which include the state welfare waiver reform dummy, state level EITC reform dummy, and I allow them change with the number of children in the household. And I also include the state employment rate and the maximum amount of federal EITC here to control for the potential reform of EITC that might cause the upward bias. So I also include the time fixed effect, the number of children fixed effect, and the beta 1, 2, 3 indicates the difference in outcomes by one more child before and after each CTC reform. The next slide, please. The column 3 and column 6 is my preferable results, and we can see that one more child in the household one more child will increase the CTC benefits the family enjoy, and it will increase the labor supply both in extensive and intensive margin. Next slide, please. For the to test the parallel trend assumption, I use the event study. If the beta, so here a year dummy indicates mothers was interviewed in year T. So if beta T is not significantly from 0 in the pre-policy period, we can conclude the assumption is valid. So next slide, please. We can see that even I change the Y, we can see the no effect for the policy. Next slide, please. Same here. If I change the Y into the working hours, it's still not significant. So next slide, please. But equation 1 didn't measure the additional dollar amount of CTC per child. How to measure the independent variable. We just know one more child will lead to the labor supply increase. So I use the simulated DID used by the Pure, Koska, and Mike Moore. And in this method, I can rescale the DID estimates in terms of $1,000 and only summarize pure change in policy varying by tax year and family size. So next slide, please. Could you please push the button here, the details here. Okay, so basically I firstly select income in 1987 and inflate all the income using CPI for each year between 1998 to 2013. And then I use the Texan calculator to get the CTC benefit based on this inflated income and the number of children in 1997. And then I collapse the sample to year and family size level to match the average CTC to the main sample using family size and interval year. And then I redo the regression, which is Y is still the labor supply, but now the X is the simulated CTC. I also include the simulated state EITC, simulated federal EITC, and in the EAT ICT to control for the potential EITC reform. And then the beta 1 now will indicate the percentage point change in labor participation rate in weekly working hours or the hours in weekly working hours when average CTC increased by $1,000. So could we go back to the main and push the button on the left hand? Yeah.
You have 2 minutes left.
Okay. So in this method, I can hold the income distribution totally constant and only have the pure change from the policy and the number of children. So next slide, please. And I get the results in the third and sixth columns, and we can see a $1,000 increase in average CTC will increase the labor participation rate by 1.13 percentage point and 0.37 hours. Next slide, please. There are some potential threats about the identification, and I have some tests to alleviate the worries. So the first is the change in demographic compositions. If the a group of single mothers change totally, and their behavior of labor supply might change as well. So I regress the demographic controls variable on the independent variable and do the balancing test to see whether the coefficients are significant. And also if their decision of whether to have more children changed over time. That means maybe some families with certain characteristics might have more children to take advantage of the CTC. How does that change their labor supply? And the last threat is that the upward trend of female labor supply since 1990 that might cause the upward bias. So in my balancing test, I don't find a change in demographic composition that will significantly change my results. And I also rerun the regression with child under 1 year old as my new outcome to see whether the CTC will lead more more single mothers has more children, but I don't find that effect. And third, I did the placebo test. I randomly gave the number of children to the single and childless mothers and redo the regression 100 times to have a kernel density function and to see, and then I see the real coefficient, whether the real coefficient fell out of this distribution. So yeah, that's the 3 threats and their findings. So next slide, please.
Okay, Wei, can you wrap up?
Yeah, so these are all the results about the balancing test, and then the next slide, please. So this the CTC and fertility, no effects of that, and the third is about the placebo test. It is, yeah, the placebo test, and we can reject the non-hypothesis now. Okay. So yeah, next. The heterogeneity. So I will run really quickly. And I don't find that the CTC has negative effect on college-educated married mothers and white mothers. And I find that Black mothers and single mothers are most responsive to the CTC, and also the single the mothers who have the children aged 3 to 5 are also very responsive to CTC. And to move to the child care part, I use the SIPP topical module, and I constrain my sample to mothers who have at least 1 child under 5, and I classify the outcomes into 4 types, which is they use parental care, they use relatives, they use the paid daycare and other care. And I find that more relatives, but they will put their children into the relatives' house instead of use the paid daycare, or they take care of their kids by themselves because they are induced into the labor market. Yeah, that's the final results of the of my paper. So next, I will go really quickly to the conclusion. So next slide. Next. I'll skip all this. Oh yeah. So I find that the initial and expansion of CTC really had positive effects on labor supply of single mothers in both extensive and intensive margin. And mothers with children who are aged 3 to 5 are most responsive to the CTC, and mothers from higher socioeconomic status are not negatively affected by the CTC benefits. So this is all I have now. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Wei. Next, we'll move to our discussants. I'll start with comments from George Haywood, who will be discussing the first payment, or the first payment, the first presentation.
I did not know we're having payments. Sign me up for those. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, perfect. All right. Well, thank you to Helly for the paper, and thank you to the SIPP conference staff for having me. I am very excited to be here and to share some thoughts with you. So in case you joined late, this paper is The Impact of Universal Preschool on Maternal Labor Supply. And I won't recap too many of the findings. I'll just say a few findings for those who may have missed it if you came late. And then I'll briefly applaud the usage of SIPP data here, which is why I know we're all at this conference. And then the way I've organized this, I'll just give a few broader suggestions after my read of the paper and some future directions where I could see this work going. So having said that, in case you joined late or missed it, this paper found a positive impact of universal childcare on mothers' labor force participation. But this was mainly in the spring semester. And what was meant by that is mainly a few months after children become eligible and enrolled in universal childcare. And that was, Helly was able to find this by taking time after a child becomes eligible and dividing it into distinct periods, which I thought was a really creative way to handle that. And Helly also found that this is mainly driven by mothers with less education. And part of the explanation for that was that more highly educated mothers may be more likely to take advantage of childcare regardless of policy at the state level, whereas those who might have fewer resources, in this case, less educated mothers, are more likely to take advantage of this program who might not otherwise be able to send their kids to early childcare. And less educated mothers also spent more time in this paper looking for jobs as well. As far as the SIPP data goes, I would absolutely love to applaud Helly for her usage here of really many of the greatest features of SIPP. So for many of you, I'm assuming all of you actually know that SIPP is longitudinal. You have cross-sectional data, which was used, but also it's a longitudinal data set, and the longitudinal data was used. And there's also monthly level in the EHC, and the monthly level data was used in this paper as well. And so before I came to Census, I wouldn't have realized how complicated that was, but to use all three in the same paper really must have been incredibly time consuming. And so I really just want to applaud the usage of that. And because of those unique features of SIPP, we were able to see the effects of children who might just be separated by 2 months, but because one child might be born 1 month too soon to be eligible for childcare in the fall, and one child is born just 1 month later or 2 months later, that they can be eligible to be enrolled in childcare in the fall. I may have switched that order, but in any case, knowing exactly what month the children were born, allowed us to see the difference between a younger cohort and an older cohort, which allowed us to see different effects on mothers coming to the labor force based on the age of their children, which is very, very cool. And the SIPP data was also connected to the NIEER State of Preschool Yearbooks. I had not heard of that, but apparently it's a source of data that allows you to see the state level variation in preschool eligibility and how old kids have to be and when those age cutoffs are and things like that. So really creative use of data in this paper. I have a few general suggestions and future directions that I'd like to share. One of them is that I would play up the policy relevance of this paper a little bit. And what I mean by that was the paper opened in the abstract and the intro by mentioning the American Families Plan. And we saw that in your presentation, which I thought was really helpful. But the American Families Plan pretty much disappears from the conversation. After that brief sentence or two in the introduction, it pretty much disappears for the rest of the paper. But I think that this is a major selling point that makes this paper attractive to a general audience nationwide. So I would say if you could play that up a little bit throughout the paper, both in the literature review, talking about the specifics of that policy and similar policies, and then coming back to it in the discussion section with how your findings might lead you to critique the policy or add on to the policy or suggest revisions to the policy or any way you could speak directly to that policy, I think makes this paper just appeal to a much wider audience, and then also has these big implications. Someone from the White House could see it and could maybe use your research down the line. And related to that point, I was wondering as I was reading this, like how much of a need specifically that this program is filling, And what I mean by that is I was thinking of the universe of non-working mothers, and some of them want to return to the labor force or to enter the labor force, but some do not, of course. So I was wondering, well, this is me thinking out loud as I'm reading the paper. What percentage of mothers that want to return to the labor force or go to the labor force are constrained by childcare specifically? And what I mean by that is, so you have the universe of mothers who are not working. Some of them are not planning to work. They're happy not working. And then for the ones who would like to go to the labor force, some of them are constrained by other reasons not to go to labor force. Maybe they're caring for a spouse, maybe they have disabled parents, they have some other reason. So even if there's universal childcare, they're still not going to necessarily go to the labor force. But then there are mothers whose main constraint to not going to the labor force is just a lack of childcare. And so if they had access to childcare, those are the mothers who'd be entering the labor force. And so I think the participation rate in your paper was about 66% of mothers in general were participating in the labor force. And I think you showed that there was an increase of about 4.6% of mothers in that spring semester entered the labor force, which it sounds great. But the reason I was thinking about those different universes is I was wondering what's the theoretical maximum that this program is intended to help, and how close is that 4.6%, that percentage point increase? Is that most of the mothers who want to work and were only constrained by the lack of childcare, or is there still a long way to go? And that's where I was thinking in the discussion, if you could tease out those differences a little bit, you could speak in the discussion about your suggestions for improving the policy if we're still missing a lot of mothers who might need a little bit more to get back into the labor force, if that is their ultimate goal. That was okay, so that was my sort of main point about the policy implications that I was thinking. A couple other suggestions I have. I know you probably can't do this with SIPP, but I would love some qualitative data on mothers. Another thing I was thinking as I was reading this was how many mothers are aware of these different policies. And you saw this delayed effect, which you speculated a little bit could be because of obligations at home, the holidays. They might not want to enter the labor force when they know Thanksgiving is coming up or Christmas or things like that. It would be great if there were any sort of interviews, even in a follow-up study with mothers in these treated states, to see their awareness of these different policies and how they made these decisions about entering the labor force. And then another thought was I really wanted to hear a little bit about fathers and or partners, but for simplicity, we could just say fathers here. And I double checked, but I didn't see any discussion of fathers in the paper, but you did point out, you do have a variable for married, whether or not the mothers are married. And if you look at in your descriptives, I think about 70% of mothers were married. So a higher percentage is married or cohabiting, because there's probably more mothers who are cohabiting. And most of those relationships, they're going to be cohabitating with a man. And most of those times it'll be the father. So, but the return to the labor force is treated and kind of conceptualized in the paper as like an individual level decision. But a lot of employment decisions are really couple level or relationship level or family level decisions. Many of these married women, even if there's universal childcare, might be talking with their spouse, their partner, hey, do you think I should go back? How should we time this? And it might depend on their partner's income, their partner's job security, their partner's job flexibility, their partner's encouragement to return to the labor force. Now, I know you might actually have access to some of those things with the SIPP data because it's household level data. And it would probably be a tremendous amount of work, though, to do it. But at least a nod to the fact that many of these decisions about women entering the labor force are actually couple level or family level decisions, I think would bolster your arguments a little bit on the back end. And I think actually, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. I can probably wrap it up there. Other than that, I had just some very minor things about just adding in the discussion about the policy relevance and then just incorporating some of those other points that I'd mentioned. But overall, I love the paper. I learned a lot. And again, I applaud you on the creative use of the data.
Great. Thank you so much, George. I'll now turn it over to Tim Smith, and then I'll give each of the authors an opportunity to respond to the comments. I see that people are answering and asking questions in the chat, so keep that up. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Tim.
Great. So I'm going to start with some sort of general remarks and then get into Ashley's paper. So I think reviewing these papers together was pretty interesting because they're looking at I think related questions in kind of a complementary way. And I think that they together tell us quite a bit about the phenomena they're looking at. So in Ashley's paper, this is a interesting paper on I think an important and pretty timely topic, as she sort of tells us in the intro, right? That childcare prices have skyrocketed. COVID and remote work have made us think a little harder about them. And I think they also highlight, like George was saying, a pretty interesting feature of the SIPP data, right? We can't use SIPP the way we want to use PSID, for example, because it doesn't get as longitudinal as we'd like. But if you can bring in the administrative records, then you get these really fine-grained details of individuals and families' lives during the snapshot, which we can then make longitudinal with the ADREC. So I think this is a really good demonstration of some of the value you can get out of SIPP if you're able to do that. So basically, this paper relies on what I think is a really good natural experiment with large reach, good targeting, and relevance to a number of things that we care about. But the paper makes pretty clear that probably we've got some parallel trends violations because of sort of macro level and labor market conditions during the sort of experimental period. I think the paper does a pretty good job of trying to mitigate that and a good job being sort of honest about that. But it looked like the triple difference that was supposed to be sort of a test, a robustness test here, ends up insignificant. So I suspect that this long-term effect is probably an upper bound. Although overall, I do think that the paper convinces me that there are positive earnings and employment effects. I just wanted to sort of highlight that this is a case where you've got a really nice natural experiment, and then other conditions in the economy as a whole makes it difficult to be totally confident in it. But I think that's something that happens a lot, and you've done a good job of handling that. For me, a bigger question than whether we can believe the difference in difference, which I think we basically can, is how plausible this treatment size is, right? If I'm understanding this properly, then the results are saying that an increase of $600 a year in tax credits is leading to really big long-term increases in earnings. And I have some trouble with that, right? Because it just seems disproportionate. And for me to believe it, I sort of have to account for the fact that these people must be pretty heavily inframarginal in the first place, right? That to have this kind of effect suggests to me that these are people who have unobservable extra propensity to want to be in the labor market, or unobserved extra propensity to be able to be high earners. And I think studying such people is actually a fine thing to do, right? Because these probably are the people who the policy is aimed at in the first place. But I just think if possible, it would be good to have a little more information on sort of how representative these workers are, and some discussion of who might be sort of outside the margins of being affected by this policy, because the choice to study only employed women, for example, is legitimate, right? But you probably do end up with a positively selected sample. Although that is sort of hard to deal with. I recognize. I think overall this is a really good paper, right? Like I said, it convinces me that this CTC worked the way it was supposed to work, and that the magnitudes are in fact moderate to large from sort of a cost effectiveness standpoint, which is, as I understand it, really have evidence on before. I've read some of the literature that Ashley's citing. It's definitely much more focused on these sort of child welfare, child development angles. which I think are important, but like getting sort of down to bread and butter of like, okay, how is this affecting what women are doing in the labor market is something that's been understudied. And I think, especially because the natural experiment ends up getting pretty muddied, I think she does a good job of convincing us that she's got a credible number, or at least a range of credible numbers here. And I think that's kind of where the end of my comments on that one. I think, yeah, definitely a good paper, but the positive selection, I think, is something that I worry about, both from a bias perspective and also from an external validity perspective. Although saying this is the population I care about in this case is pretty reasonable. Now on Wei's paper, I think there's an interesting contrast here, right? Because the way Ashley's thinking about this is, okay, I'm going to take the SIP and I'm gonna merge it with AdRec. What Wei's doing is really zooming in on the institutional details of this policy, to try to get specifically at a population that's actually, if anything, negatively selected, right? We're looking at single mothers who are disproportionately low educational attainment, and I think that's really interesting, because the sort of spoiler is that Wei finds a pretty significant impact on these people's employment as well, which makes me really confident that this program is working as intended. And I think the way she's able to do this with just the SIP data is really impressive. And showcases kind of why we spend all that time reviewing the SIP to make sure it works. So the main results do follow a fairly standard difference in difference. I like the way you control for the EITC expansions, which are concurrent here, right? That obviously doesn't handle the sort of macro trends in the labor market with increasing female employment, Great Recession exposure, et cetera. But that's really hard to deal with. I think handling the EITC is really smart, and strengthens the analysis. And I think it's interesting that the benefits were the largest for children who are neither sort of too young, and so available for early child subsidies, or too old and thus unavailable in general. I think that almost acts as kind of a placebo test, right? Like that is consistent with these other papers, and also, to me, reinforces the robustness of what you're finding. I also, the one thing I want to sort of focus on here is that I think the time use exercise that you get into is really interesting. I sort of got the sense from the paper that this is maybe a somewhat late addition, because there wasn't sort of as much information on this. But I think that if you have sort of time and energy and enough data, sort of doubling down on this would be I think really interesting. Because what you're finding, to me, is not intuitive, which definitely doesn't mean that it's wrong, but I'd be really interested in how you're able to explain what's going on behaviorally with these people, right? Because they're consuming less market childcare and a lot more family childcare. And I can think of I could imagine that making sense, right? Because these are relatively poorer households that are going to have to be relying, as I would understand it, on sort of family more in general, especially as the price of childcare keeps skyrocketing. But I just don't get a real sense of what that looks like behaviorally. I was thinking maybe there's sort of an insurance story here, where the subsidy gets more generous, and you sort of know that the money will be there, so you go back into the labor market, but then rely on family because that's cheaper or something. That's of course really hard to test in the data, but I'm just, if possible, telling us something about what choices these families are actually making, and how that fits into the microeconomics of their households would be super interesting. And I really like the way that you've used the SIP time use data to try to say something about patterns in childcare consumption, as well as the patterns in labor market participation. So that was a really cool piece, I thought. Overall, though, this paper, it does something that I think is very different from Ashley's paper in the way it focuses on a certain population. It's not getting into the timing, but it's zooming in specifically on this group of people who are both less advantaged, but also have a less contaminated effect of the subsidy increase. And what we see is that yeah, even for these people who don't necessarily have the advantages that make the pretty large effect Ashley finds, we actually do see the employment effect that policymakers were hoping to see. And I find the case pretty convincing here as well. So overall, a really cool pair of papers that complement one another well. I enjoyed reading them and thinking about them. I hope these comments have been at least somewhat helpful. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. I'd now like to give each of the presenters just a couple minutes to respond and give any final comments. I'll start with Kelly.
Okay. So, what I should do now, answer the questions in the chat box or
anything you want. So I think you've answered most of the questions in the chat box. If there's anything you want to respond to with George's comments or any final concluding statements you want to make, or anything you want to restate that was in the chat.
Yeah, I think George's recommendation is very helpful, and I think I will consider that. And yeah, I'm still writing the paper, so for the so there is still a lot of things need to be done. And in the chat box, I think there is a question about, let me see. Sorry, I cannot find it. I think there is a question about this matrix 2010 and South 2014. So I'm not sure. For the Fitzpatrick 2010, she finds that there is no effect, and in the footnote she mentioned that the labor supply questions intend to refer to the whole year, while the program have only affected mothers of 4 years old in the last 4 or 5 months of 1999. So in this paper, she mainly focused on the fourth semester, and I find there is also no effect for the fourth semester. So my result is kind of the same. My result is consistent with her findings, and for the South 2014, there is a positive effect, and I don't think I mentioned that any paper that found larger effect for more educated mothers, because the crowd-out effect for more educated mothers is larger. Yeah. And I think another paper that's close to my research is Casio 2013. And this paper finds that with the triple difference model, Casio 2013 finds that the universal pre-K have positive effect on less educated mothers, but not more educated mothers. But the problem for this paper is that with the definitive model, she cannot find the same result, and my identification strategy is different from her paper because she studied the impact of introduction of the pre-K program, but I study different sources of variations. So I'm not sure whether this is enough for the question or is there anyone else who wants to discuss more about my paper? Sorry, I'm a little bit tired, so I don't know what I'm talking about. Sorry.
No, and that's great, Haley. And I just want to thank the presenters because I know for 2 of you, this is between like 2 and 4 a.m. So very much appreciated. This is really extreme time for you. So thank you. And if anyone has any questions, you can ask them in the chat as well, or also email at a more reasonable hour, perhaps. Ashley, would you like to give any comments, responses to the discussion?
Yeah, sure. So I want to start by saying thank you to Tim. That was a great discussion of my paper, and I really appreciate the thorough reading. I think the only thing I really want to talk about has to do with the size of the program. So I think that it can be a little difficult to talk about at the federal level because there actually is quite a bit of state level variation in this program. So while federally the average amount might be like $555, there are some states that as much as double that. And so I actually have, it's in the appendix of my paper and hasn't been validated against the gold standard file, but I actually have a simulated instrument where I look at the effect of a change in the ratio of child independent care benefits to cost of child care. And my results using that method are pretty similar to the ones that I find here. So it's probably slightly more convincing for some people, given that it's a simulated instrument, but generally speaking, if I'm really holding constant the cost of childcare, I'm still finding these pretty large effects. And if I separated it into people who are likely eligible and likely ineligible, I'm still finding statistically significant effects, and it's less likely to be biased, it's less likely to be biased than potentially my difference and difference. But I do want to be wary of time. I'm happy to answer any other questions. My email is probably somewhere. But again, thank you so much, Tim, for your discussion.
Great, thank you, Ashley. Wei, any last comments, responses?
Because of the disconnection when Tim asked questions, I'm not sure whether I take all the notes of his questions, but I will try to answer some of them. So first, Tim mentioned about the long time span. We have a lot of concurrent policies, including the macroeconomic status and the EITC reforms. So I will admit that some of my controls might not totally consider all the policies, but I try to get the state welfare reform and the state unemployment, which measured the labor demand, and all the EITC measures I can use in this data. So I might miss some policies, but I'm pretty sure that the most important one I already include in my controls. And the second, maybe I misunderstand the questions. Tim mentioned that the childcare stories doesn't make sense or it's not very intuitive. So the question, the problem is that in my data I couldn't observe the price of the paid childcare. But I do observe that when the mothers go into the labor market, they tend to put their children in their relatives' house, which provides some free and part-time childcare, and they tend to ask their grandparents of the children for help, because they might because the CTC benefit doesn't provide enough money for them to choose the paid childcare. So that's my answers to Tim's questions, and I also received the question in the chat box about the ULA papers from May 2021. I do realize that they find some negative effect of the newly expanded CTC. While I do admit that if the CTC becomes a pure lump sum subsidy to all the families, the effects might change. But in my papers, I examined all the three reforms with the income threshold, and what I find about the mothers from higher socioeconomic status, I find that they are not negatively affected even if they receive the lump sum subsidy from CTC. In my opinion, they are from the higher socioeconomic status, and they try to keep their work even if they receive lump sum subsidy. Their income effects are not that strong to let them give up their jobs. So that's my answers to questions from Becky. Yeah. Thank you for all the questions and comments.
Great, thank you so much, Wei. So we have like 1 or 2 minutes. If anyone has any additional questions, you can put your hand up in the chat or type it into the chat. Otherwise, I just put a couple job postings. We're trying to hire for someone exactly to do some of this analysis work. So please consider applying if anyone is interested. Otherwise, I really appreciate all the thoughtful presentations and the comments from the discussants. So really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all over the next day and a half, I guess. Yes, and absolutely thank you to our presenters coming from very different time zones in the middle of the night. So very much appreciated. Okay, well, thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day or night, whichever it is. Thank you.